We have some breaking news. I mean, it's not that breaking, but and we don't know what's going to happen. It's more like a breaking announcement.
And we're going to be doing more and more of that. We're going to be looking at Department of Education. We're going to be looking at, and we're going to be doing more and more of that. We're going to be looking at Department of Education. We're going to be looking at even our military. We're going to be looking at tremendous amounts of money, Peter, being spent on things that bear no relationship to anything and have no value. We're talking about trillions of dollars. It will be, in the end, trillions of dollars being absolutely wasted, and perhaps illegally. I would say certainly in many cases illegally, but perhaps illegally overall. And I'm very proud of the job that this group of young people, generally young people, but very smart people, they're doing. They're doing it at my insistence. It would be a lot easier not to do it, but we have to take some of these things apart to find the corruption. We found tremendous corruption.
So Donald Trump is talking about the next targets of DOGE. The Department of Government Efficiency, named for a meme coin introduced by Elon Musk. And it's now being led by young people, including one, these kind of Adderall-fueled Musk employees, including one alias Big Balls, who was fired for naughty social media postings. And, he's saying we'll go after the Department of Education and military. Does that mean the Pentagon? They're actually going to do what they just did to USAID to the Pentagon? We'll talk about USAID and the history of USAID. But since Trump has mentioned this, Elon Musk has benefited handsomely from corporate welfare from the Pentagon. That's partly why he is so wealthy. I mean, billions of dollars to fund all of his projects, some of which blew up in midair, many of which blew up in midair. And so I question whether the DOGE staffer, alias Big Balls, would live up to his name and go after the Pentagon, which is it's the most corrupt entity in human history. Probably. I mean, maybe unless you consider Wall Street an entity. But there's just so much bloat there, so much waste, so much opacity. How many audits has the Pentagon refused to conduct or failed? 7?
I've lost track, but Pete Hegseth, the new defense secretary, he just said that his goal is that by the end of his term, his 4-year term in office, that the Pentagon is able to pass one audit. He did lay that out as a goal, as if like it should be even like something that you should like see as like not a requirement. Instead, it's aspirational that we be able to pass an audit. But that's how corrupt and bloated the Pentagon is, that it's like seen as like it would be some sort of achievement if the Pentagon could pass an audit.
It's never passed an audit. And what you would find there if you directed like real energy would be so shocking to the U.S. taxpayer. But they don't understand the whole U.S. economy since World War II has been fueled by the military industry. And I mean, FDR understood this during World War II, that in a capitalist system, you cannot develop with state sponsorship a massive military industry needed to win a world war unless you incentivize it for the business chieftains, the power elite. Otherwise, they'll turn on you and coup you out. They'll coup you out, and they won't participate. So incentivizing means you let them skim massive amounts off the top through contracts. They keep the money. They dole it out to their accountant, their managers, their employees get, McMansions in the suburbs. And that system has really prevailed since World War II, to the point where the Pentagon budget is closing in on $1 trillion. But trillions of dollars are lost and missing from the budget, and the public has no idea where it's going. So what they're focusing on right now is basically a lemonade stand compared to the Pentagon. But it's still important. USAID, it's still important to focus on USAID. We at the Grayzone have been covering USAID ever since we existed as a CIA front organization. And the old timers following this stream right now, those of you who lived through the good old days of the Church Commission might remember old Dan Mitrione, the USAID contractor who was sent to instruct the right-wing dictatorship of Paraguay in torture tactics and was kidnapped by the Tupamaro guerrillas and held hostage until he was eventually killed. His cover was USAID, and he was there to help Operation Condor develop and to crush the socialist and communist left across South America. And that's really the essence of USAID. Those of you who don't remember that episode, go watch State of Siege, great film by one of the greatest political directors in human history, Costa Gavras. And that's the story of Dan Mitrione of the USAID. But we're told now that what Trump has done to USAID is preventing children from being fed in Africa. And, you know, all these children across the world are going to die. But USAID is something that's participated in killing. And actually, Senator Chris Murphy from Connecticut admitted this at a massive protest outside USAID headquarters filled with Democrats and young liberals who didn't protest the Gaza genocide and didn't get out in the streets for anything in the past 4 years. They're now up in arms because their website at USAID has gone offline and their funding has been frozen as DOGE investigates. Here's Chris Murphy, Democrat from Connecticut.
The senator from Connecticut, Senator Chris Murphy.
So Elon Musk has been floating all sorts of awful, terrible conspiracy theories about what happens at USAID. Let's make it very clear that every single day, America is safer because of what happens at USAID.
Notice there's Ilhan Omar to his left nodding along.
USAID fights terrorist groups all across this world, making sure that we address the underlying causes for a retreat to terrorism. USAID chases China all around the world, making sure that China doesn't monopolize contracts for critical minerals and port infrastructure all around the world. It supports freedom fighters everywhere in this world. Up until yesterday, delivering firewood, for instance, to the brave Ukrainian defenders on the Eastern Front.
Yeah.
This reminds me of when he admitted right after the coup in Ukraine. This reminds me of when he admitted right after the coup in Ukraine in 2014 that we played an instrumental role in this. If not for our involvement in Ukraine, this change of regime wouldn't have happened. That's what Chris Murphy said back in 2014 after the government of Yanukovych was overthrown, setting off this whole current mess in Ukraine that we're still currently mired in. So this is another admission from Murphy about the real purposes of USAID. I have no doubt that some important things are being targeted by Musk, like, you know, the criticism that this affected AIDS treatment for people in Africa. That, you know, I mean, yeah. I mean, I have no doubt that obviously, like, Elon Musk is not taking his cost cutting to 100% like nefarious things. There's obviously some genuine humanitarian aid being cut up in this, but what Democrats are totally obscuring is what the rest of the world knows, that USAID is used for the very nefarious purposes that Murphy kind of admitted to right there. It's not about delivering aid, it's about destabilizing countries that are marked for regime change.
Yeah. And even PEPFAR is a soft power program that's meant to signal that we actually care about Africa while we prevent strong states from developing their own healthcare systems. Samantha Power also echoed Chris Murphy. This was the head at the time of USAID. She's since been fired and is soon to appear at some kind of sleazy consulting firm on K Street or at an Ivy League university. Probably.
I mean, she's saying that I'm supposed to be a funny show, and that is probably the funniest thing seen on the Stephen Colbert Show in a long time. Countries are bullied into going along with the U.S., and that's what people like Samantha Power have done. You can read about it in WikiLeaks, and USAID is involved in this, bullying Haiti, for example, into lowering its minimum wage. That's what diplomats like Samantha Power have been up to around the world. And that's what she's lamenting, is the fact that Elon Musk might be putting an end to that. But which I actually doubt. The thing is, I don't think Elon Musk and Trump, they're going to go after the really nefarious things that USAID does. I mean, in some cases, I'm sure some of it will be touched. Like we've seen in Ukraine, people complaining that these so-called independent media outlets aren't being funded anymore because but then you have to ask yourself, how are you an independent outlet in Ukraine if the US government is funding you? But I don't think Elon Musk and Trump are actually going to take the proverbial axe to the real shady things that USAID does. It's more that they're touting how they're going after so-called woke programs, which are relatively trivial compared to what USAID really does around the world.
Well, here is Reporters Without Borders. And we're supposed to be outraged by this. In Ukraine, 9 out of 10 media outlets rely on USAID funding. In Ukraine, where 9 out of 10 media outlets rely on USAID funding, several local media have already announced the suspension of their activities and are searching for alternative solutions. At Slidsvo .info, 80% of our budget is affected. Anna Babinet, CEO and co-founder of the independent investigative media outlet based in Kiev, says
it's not independent. How can you call it independent after admitting you take 80% of your budget from the American government? It just doesn't make any sense.
You wouldn't be considered independent in the US, but I guess anything that's not Russian is considered independent by Reporters Without Borders, which I think itself is funded by Western states. But this says so much about the way the media works internationally, and it also hints at the real motive for Trump targeting USAID. But let's talk about Ukraine first. I mean, we've talked about this constantly. You're publishing a book at some point in the future about this.
At some point.
There was a coup in 2014 in Ukraine, and the country, sponsored by the US, in order to shift and reorient the country toward NATO and the EU, and anything that was remotely Russian was considered a hostile internal force and was effectively outlawed, which meant that 45% of the population were considered a Trojan horse for Russian interests. This meant major Ukrainian businessmen and politicians like Viktor Medvedchuk, who founded the Patriots for Life party in Ukraine and owned 3 major TV stations and media outlets, became effectively a criminal. He was criminalized. And after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which his party condemned, they were first and foremost a Ukrainian Russian-speaking population, mostly in the East. He was jailed and tortured by the Ukrainian SBU. But before that, the United States State Department under Joe Biden celebrated and supported and encouraged Vladimir Zelensky to ban all of those media outlets serving the Russian-speaking population. And what they did was they imposed on Ukraine a neo-colonial, pro-Western media ecosystem completely funded by USAID, where the messaging was also influenced by USAID. And what were they saying? Hromadski, for example, which sprouted up on the eve of the Maidan coup. They were pushing them towards war with Russia. Conflict, hate Russia, fight Russia, no economic cooperation with Russia. That's what USAID does. It drives us toward nuclear war. And also, Aaron, Ukraine was a key instrument in you can call it the deep state attempt to dislodge Donald Trump through impeachment. So I think one reason they're targeting it is because, USAID, if they leave all these administrators in there who are liberals and hate Donald Trump, they can start creating scandals abroad through their mighty Wurlitzer of media outlets, whether it's in Georgia, whether it's in Latin America, whether it's in Ukraine, where they just control all so much of a country's media, as well as their NGOs, and they can turn this against Trump.
Yeah, and the irony, by the way, of the U.S. controlling so much of Ukrainian media is that, like, what is this proxy war supposed to be all about? It's supposed to be about helping Ukraine resist the takeover by Russia, being subsumed by Russia and its apparatus. Well, at the cost of being consumed totally by the U.S., being a U.S. proxy where the U.S. runs everything, to the point where your independent media outlets, so-called independent media, can't even survive without U.S. government funding. On the point about Medvedchuk, the Ukrainian, opposition leader who's close to Putin, the U.S. was so on board with cracking down on Medvedchuk's opposition party and his affiliated TV networks that an aide to Zelensky later admitted that after Medvedchuk's opposition TV channels were taken off of the air and there was this case brought against them, that this was a welcome gift for the Biden administration. So Zelensky conceived of this crackdown on this Russian ally in Ukraine as a welcome gift to Biden. That's how much Biden was pushing Ukraine towards this path of confrontation, to the point where Zelensky thought it would be a welcome gift for Biden to jail and take off the air the TV channels of his biggest rival, because Medvedchuk at that time was actually leading Zelensky in some polls. This is in early 2021, right after Biden takes office, which then sets Ukraine on the path to Russia's invasion 1 year later. And yeah, this absolutely, I think, is tied to Russiagate. Mark Ames has pointed this out. So many of these Ukrainian actors have been involved in spreading the claims that were used about to push the claims of Trump-Russia collusion and Russian interference. Ukraine's intelligence services played a key role in giving John Brennan, head of the CIA, so-called intelligence that was used for Russiagate, including the claim that Russia hacked the DNC. This only came out recently that Ukrainian intelligence was involved in that. So absolutely, the MAGA camp is now taking revenge on Ukraine for this. And so, yeah, Ukraine will be caught up in it. But overall, around the world, do I see Elon Musk really rolling back the programs that push U.S. hegemony via USAID? I'm doubtful of that. I think Ukraine is an exception because of its integral role in undermining Trump. But I suspect elsewhere we'll get a pass.
Yeah, I mean, what they'll ultimately do is move, if they can even pull it off, they would like to move USAID under the auspices of the State Department so it could be more easily controlled. And they'll privatize large parts of it and probably profit from contracts. But it's not as though it's going to go away. But it is amazing to see them gum up the works. And I do think they're serious about defunding a lot of these outlets, which serve no purpose to Trump and really are in the way of the deal that Trump wants to make over Ukraine. They're obstructing it.
Well, on that point, that's what I wonder now. I mean, Trump certainly has no interest in funding people who have undermined him. And this includes, for example, like Nina Jankowicz. You remember her, who was going to be the disinformation czar for Biden until her videos were just so embarrassing. She was totally caught up in this. She worked in Ukraine. She pushed these U.S. She worked for Zelensky's campaign. Exactly. So you have a huge overlap there that Trump and Elon Musk have no interest in funding. But then when it comes to reaching an overall goal, an overall deal in Ukraine, Trump talks about that, but is he actually going to, use the political capital to go up against neocon forces in Washington to push through some kind of peace deal in Ukraine that addresses Russian security concerns after so much money has been invested in fueling a proxy war simply because Biden refused to take NATO expansion off of the table? I can see Trump saying, yeah, we're not going to let Ukraine into NATO. I can see him doing that. But for example, is he going to agree to dismantle the so-called missile defense sites in Poland and Romania and to roll back NATO military infrastructure surrounding Russia as Russia has demanded? That part, I doubt. And we're seeing Trump talk about it now. He's saying, like, to Ukraine, if you want us to keep funding you, we want your rare earth minerals. And that's his new message. And if he can get a promise from Ukraine to that effect, which I'm sure Zelensky is on board with, Zelensky is just a complete sellout to his own country, then I could see maybe Trump continuing this. Although then the question becomes, even if Ukraine does promise Trump access to its rare earth minerals, can it actually offer anything when Russia has taken control of the territory where those resources are?
Yeah, Poland is the site of Fort Trump. Don't think there's going to be much of a rollback of NATO there under Trump. This is happening right now at USAID headquarters. Josh Rogan, Neocon propagandist, is complaining they're literally erasing USAID from the Ronald Reagan building. Reagan, a huge supporter of U.S. foreign assistance, must be turning in his grave. Oh, man, I wish I was there to see that.
Okay, well, listen, fair enough. So then I have to temper my skepticism of Musk. Like, if people like Josh Rogan are freaking out, I can only welcome that as a positive development and say that maybe actually they're onto something here, because, of course, Rogan represents the bipartisan neocon agenda. And if he's worried about Reagan turning in his grave, then that means actually...
maybe that's revenge for the Contras and the raping of Salvadoran nuns and the Mujahideen creating Al-Qaeda. I don't know. If this can spiritually damage Reagan, that would be great. One of the worst presidents in American history. What are we paying for, though? I mean, like, it's a lot of money. Billions of dollars went to support media in the Republic of Georgia, like billions of dollars. This is not that I necessarily think that it would be great for American media, but this is while newsrooms across the U.S. are collapsing and being bought up and consolidated by corporate interests, which then sell them off to giant investment firms. There's no investment there. More money is being spent on regime change media abroad. And here's what Samantha Power said about where the money was going. She said this openly at an event that Anya Parampil and I attended in DC at a major theater in downtown DC, where they're rolling out this everything app for Ukrainians that USAID, in partnership with Visa and Uber and all of these other Silicon Valley firms, were aiming to force all Ukrainians to use in order to have vaccine passports and to report their neighbor to the SBU because they're a Russian spy through an app called E-Enemy, and to report Russian positions and have their passport and their digital ID in this utopia that we're creating in Ukraine. There was this admission from Samantha Power about where our money is going.
One of the things that Congress has given USAID since this full-scale invasion began is an unprecedented amount of money in direct budget support, which sounds kind of obvious. Of course, we would do that. We want to stand with Ukraine, but it's totally unprecedented, this kind of scale of investment. And we're talking along the lines of about $15 billion in a sense, cash to the Ukrainian government, which was famously corrupt, in past years, and still has work, as you noted, to do on corruption today.
So she's openly saying we've given unprecedented money to a famously corrupt government.
I don't know if we could have gotten that money out of Congress if not for DIA. Because what DIA allows us to do is that direct budget support goes, yes, to the Ukrainian government, but then it goes to pay teachers, to pay healthcare workers, to pay first responders. And there's a digital trail. It's not, some official deciding this or that. It actually is going directly into the bank accounts in a manner that it would have been untraceable in a prior regime.
So, let's just assume that DIA, the DIA app, makes it traceable and transparent and not corrupt. We're still paying the salaries of Ukrainian teachers. And how are teachers doing in the United States? Why are we doing that? We weren't doing that before Maidan. We kind of were, but not on the same scale. Why do we have to pay Ukrainian first responders and paying like pensions for Ukrainians? Like, have you seen what the United States looks like now? There's like a legitimate anger about USAID. Yeah. And Elon is marketing it as, there's drag shows they're paying for, and they are. They're literally paying for like like trans comic books and drag shows around the world. It's really happening, but that's peanuts compared to what they're doing that we know about, which is much more scandalous. That's just a way of marketing it to like the low IQ MAGA online Neanderthal that's just like, well, they're going to come and traffic our children,
And there's the problem with Democrats, the progressive Democrats like Bernie Sanders. They should have been leading the call and saying, why are we funding the pensions and salaries of Ukrainian teachers when we don't pay ours? But they didn't.
Yeah.
They all voted to fund this actually in lockstep, which is a huge lost opportunity, because who else is going to advance a progressive agenda calling for spending money actually on teachers here? It's not going to be Elon Musk, obviously. They want to cut the Department of Education. So progressives lost a huge opportunity to call this out. And instead they voted for it. And there was just very little questions about it, including from progressive media. On the issue of corruption in Ukraine, I mean, I've stopped paying attention to the stories about it because it's just, everyone knows now there's so much corruption. But one anecdote that I recently caught my eye was Ukraine's chief military psychiatrist was arrested on allegations that he amassed more than $1 million since the beginning of Russia's invasion, including multiple properties and at least 4 BMWs. So that's like the chief military psychiatrist being arrested. And for everyone who gets caught, you don't know how many people are just making out like bandits. And this is all paid for by U.S. taxpayers.
Yeah. A little isolationism in the Democratic Party would go a long way. Why are we paying Matt Duss's salary in Bernie's office? I mean, we pay for those tools like in congressional staffers.
And I'm sorry, and I forgot to mention the most important thing. Zelensky recently admitted that there's been like more than $177 billion allocated by the U.S. to Ukraine, and Zelensky said, we've only received $77 billion of this. I don't know where all the money is. That was Zelensky's admission. I won't play the clip because we'll have to translate it. But yeah, he said that I don't know where half of this money is. So even Zelensky doesn't know.
Lex Friedman as well in English.
Okay. Well,
listen.
So Zelensky openly admits that, oh yeah, like we haven't seen half of this money that's been allocated towards us. And maybe the explanation there is that, yeah, because all that money went to U.S. defense contractors. So that's why Zelensky didn't see it. But if it was actually allocated for Ukraine and Zelensky saying, yeah, I don't know where half of it is, like what does that say about just how much money has gone into corruption and greed that we'll never even know about?
Well, it's mainly our corruption. It's what I was saying before. Like this is the post-World War II economy. We create these wars and then launder money that's washed from the pockets of the U.S. taxpayer through the conflict area, Afghanistan. Where'd all that money go? Ukraine, where'd all that money go? Of course, it gets siphoned off by the local honchos, the local warlords. But most of it goes back to contractors in the U.S. And so they need war. And the masters of violence are effectively in charge of our society. Palantir, Peter Thiel, and Alex Karp. I mean, the AI warlords, those guys are basically in charge of the Trump administration. So that's what it's about. That's what Zelensky's talking about. USAID is, of course, part of that. The international development industry just creates so much waste and corruption. And I guess they went after it because it's an easy target. It's great to have this. It's a teachable moment. That's what you get, with Trump. There's no endorsement of his agenda. I mean, I think so much of this is about privatization. But with Trump, you get so many more teachable moments where clarity about U.S. empire suddenly appears, and more of the American public begins to understand it's not working in their favor. I mean, why would any red-blooded American want to pay for the BBC? This is treason. This is literal treason. Whoever wrote this grant should be tried for treason. Did you know the third largest funder of the BBC's charitable arm is USAID? This is journalist Matt Kennard. This isn't, this is from December 2024. December 18th, my birthday. I missed it because I was having such a great time. I missed this tweet. The U.S. government agency gives £2 million per year, which is like, what, $3 million a year to the BBC. The organization works in partnership with BBC World Service, local media in 35 countries to mentor and train journalists, which basically means to make them into like good Western propagandists. And you can see here that is documented. I mean, that it shouldn't be happening. We should just pay less taxes instead of giving money to Ukrainian media, the BBC, Nicaraguan media. I probably don't have time to feature it, but at the Grayzone, we produced a short documentary about a Nicaraguan television station called 100% Noticias, 100% News, which was funded by USAID. And in 2018, during the months-long coup to dislodge the popularly elected socialist-oriented Sandinista government in Nicaragua, one of the largest workers' movements in the Western Hemisphere as their base, through violence, shutting down the country, destroying the economy, torturing and murdering people at checkpoints. 100% Noticias featured calls for murdering the president, Daniel Ortega, and his wife, calls for people to come out in the streets and riot, to attack their neighbors who were Sandinistas, which was happening every day. They were making heroes out of the criminal class of Nicaragua that was torturing people. And this was funded by USAID. And then when the station was shut down, all the fake journalists, press freedom groups, Committee to Protect Journalists came out and complained that this was Daniel Ortega's evil repression, as if the United States would have permitted Russia and China to hype up riots in their, that went well beyond anything we saw with BLM in their own cities. They wouldn't have tolerated it. Actually, the directors of that station were released in a deal to that maybe relieve sanctions on Nicaragua. I can't remember what the deal was. But, I mean, we're talking about the encouragement of violence, killing by USAID. This will never be brought up. Violence in the service of regime change to produce more free market governments, of course. This will never be brought up by Elon Musk. He'll never mention Juan Guaido making off with all the money. It would be great if they went after Juan Guaido, but that would offend the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who is involved in the whole Juan Guaido regime change sham. But the Venezuelan opposition is furious right now at Guaido and Carlos Vecchio, his fake ambassador in Washington, for making off with USAID money. This is our money to create a fake government in Venezuela that became cover for stealing Citgo, the largest foreign asset of the Venezuelan government, starving it of cash, and then producing one of the worst migration crises in recent history, flooding the U.S. with Venezuelan migrants who were fleeing a country whose economy had been destroyed by the U.S. They got TPS, and then they became the scapegoat for Donald Trump to get elected, and now they're all being sent home. I don't know if there's going to be any sanctions relief, but USAID was at the center of this through Juan Guaido. This is not aiding people. Those people could have used aid. They could have used an actual economy and a healthcare system, but we blocked it. And USAID was involved. It was at the forefront of the coup attempt and the fake humanitarian aid stunt on the Venezuelan-Colombian border. It trained Juan Guaido. It trained all of his lackeys. It paid the Venezuelan opposition and ultimately helped create this migration crisis. And, Elon Musk is onto something when he says they're funding like drag shows and stuff like that. We discovered this in our look at the International Republican Institute. We'll have a new piece up about this later today. Yeah, Republicans, MAGA, and leftists should unite against USAID and the National Endowment for Democracy. The International Republican Institute is a subsidiary of the National Endowment for Democracy, the regime change arm of the U.S. government, which works hand in glove with USAID. And they paid rappers, artists, actors, and sponsored quote-unquote transgender dance performances to, in their own words, destabilize Bangladesh's politics. And these are documents that we helped uncover. That was a tweet by Wyatt Reed of the Grayzone. Here it is. Transgender dance performance, which featured 100 visitors attended the program, including local officials and members of the U.S. Embassy. Now, there's nothing wrong. I'm not condemning transgender dance performances per se, but why should U.S. taxpayers pay for them to sponsor regime change in a place where we don't even understand? Well, no Americans are even can even understand what's happening. Sheikh Hasina was put in power, was displaced from power because she had rejected a U.S. military base in Bangladesh, and Mohammed Yunus was put in power as president, who was on the payroll of the Clinton Foundation and was a microloan shark. So that's what happened there. But I'm saying when we exposed this in Cuba as well at the Grayzone, USAID was paying rappers in Cuba to promote regime change, grooming rappers, and grooming the Afro-Cuban population to pit them against the Cuban revolutionary government as the U.S. sanctions Cuba's government to death. USAID did that. So any leftist who supports Cuba's revolution, who's outraged by what Elon is doing to USAID, is a socialist and a fake leftist.
One point I want to stress is that USAID, NED, it's not just used to fund, propaganda directed at foreign societies. It's also used to fund propaganda directed at U.S. taxpayers to manufacture consent for U.S. foreign policy, for regime change, for all these proxy wars. And one of the ways they do it is they fund so-called civil society in these targeted countries that happens to align with U.S. foreign policy goals. So just here's one example. This is Democracy Now! Recently interviewing somebody from what's called the Ukrainian Center for Civil Liberties, okay? And they're going to argue against what else but diplomacy with Russia.
People in Ukraine want peace much more than anyone else because the war is horrible. But peace doesn't come when a country which was invaded stopped resisting to Russian aggression. That's not peace. That's occupation. And occupation is horrible. It's just the same word, but in another form, because Russian occupation means torture, rapes, enforced disappearances, denial of your own identity, forcible adoption of your children, filtration camps, and mass graves. And that's why we have no other choice. Because if we stop resisting to Russian aggression, it will be no more us. People in Ukraine want peace.
So note there, the Chiron identifies that speaker as a Ukrainian human rights lawyer, Ukrainian Center for Civil Liberties. It sounds, it sounds great. It sounds like really benign. And who wouldn't support civil liberties? But what Democracy Now! Doesn't inform its audience is that the Ukrainian Center for Civil Liberties is funded by USAID. And this is like an openly admitted thing. USAID calls that same lawyer the head of the USAID supported Ukrainian Center for Civil Liberties. USAID has helped more than 50 civil society organizations, including the Ukrainian Center for Civil Liberties. And she's even a recipient, or she's even on the steering committee of what's called the World Movement for Democracy, which is a project of the National Endowment for Democracy, a notorious front for the CIA. And so American audiences, even a progressive audience, in the case of Democracy Now!, get presented with people from these benign sounding groups, Ukrainian Center for Civil Liberties, and they failed and I don't know why Democracy Now! Didn't disclose this. Maybe they didn't know. They're funded by the same U.S. government programs that support regime change around the world as Democracy Now! Used to expose a long time ago. And that's how it works. It's like you fund people in foreign countries with these benign sounding groups, and the U.S. population that's footing the bill isn't informed that actually they're funded by their own government.